She whispered it like a secret. "You're trouble, and I like trouble." And just like that, my quiet life was about to change forever. The first time I saw her, she was carrying a box down the hallway, moving with a quiet elegance that made me pause mid-step. She had this way of holding herself, confident, poised, yet there was a softness beneath it, like someone who had learned to be careful with her heart. I told myself it was just curiosity, a natural response to a new neighbor. But even as I repeated that in my head, I felt my chest tighten, a strange mixture of admiration and something unspoken stirring inside me. Our eyes met briefly as she passed, and in that instant, her gaze held a flicker of recognition, a quiet spark of mischief almost hidden behind her calm composure. I stepped aside, and our hands brushed for the briefest moment as she balanced her box. It was accidental, but it left a warmth lingering in my fingers, a subtle reminder that even small touches can carry meaning. She smiled politely, and there was a faint curiosity in her eyes, as though she could sense my own hesitance, my quiet fascination. The hallway was still except for the soft echo of our footsteps, yet the air felt charged. I noticed details I didn't mean to, the way her hair caught the light, a few strands falling across her cheek, the soft floral scent that lingered as she passed, and the rhythm of her movements, unhurried but precise. Even the smallest gestures, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her fingers lightly gripped the box, made her presence feel larger than it should. Our first proper conversation came unexpectedly at the mailbox. "Hello," she said softly, and the warmth in her voice caught me off guard. I stammered a reply, feeling the odd mix of nervousness and curiosity. The conversation was brief, almost mundane, but every glance, every small smile seemed weighted with meaning. Her eyes crinkled slightly when she laughed, hinting at a kindness and life experience I couldn't yet fully grasp. Walking back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She was more than just a new neighbor, she was a quiet force, a presence that stirred questions I didn't yet have answers to. Even in the short span of a few minutes, she had left an impression on me, subtle yet undeniable, and I realized that my life, however ordinary, might never feel the same again. A few days after our first brief meeting, fate, or maybe just bad timing, brought us together again. I was coming home from the grocery store, juggling a couple of bags when I saw her in the hallway. She was bending to pick up something that had fallen from her own bags, and without thinking, I stepped forward to help. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying that warmth that seemed to settle something in my chest. Our hands met briefly as I handed her a small carton she hadn't been able to reach, and I felt that same fleeting spark from the first touch. There was nothing sexual about it, just a simple, human connection, but it lingered in my awareness long after. As she straightened up, she laughed lightly, a sound that was both playful and gentle, like she was amused not just by the clumsiness of the situation but by life itself. I caught a glimpse of vulnerability in her eyes, something that spoke of loss and resilience in the same breath. There was a pause, an almost delicate hesitation, before she added, "I guess you're the kind of neighbor who shows up when trouble strikes." I smiled, feeling a rush of warmth mixed with nervousness. "I hope that's a good thing?" I asked, letting my own curiosity peek through my words. Her laugh was quiet but genuine. "It can be," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward mine, holding my gaze longer than necessary. That glance carried more than casual interest, it was subtle, yet undeniably charged with something unspoken. We ended up chatting for a few minutes, talking about trivial things at first, groceries, the building, small neighborhood quirks. But beneath those light exchanges, there was a deeper layer forming. I noticed how she spoke, thoughtfully choosing her words, giving small glimpses of herself without revealing too much. When she mentioned her love of late-night reading or the old songs she liked to play on weekends, it felt like a window into her life, brief, tender, and fragile. At one point, our hands brushed again as she handed me a bag that had slipped from her grip. The contact was brief, yet it carried that same warmth that made my heart beat a little faster. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked away with a faint smile, a gesture that was innocent but intimate in its own way. As I walked back to my apartment, carrying my groceries and the echo of our conversation, I realized that curiosity was no longer enough. There was something compelling about her, a mixture of confidence and quiet vulnerability that pulled me in. I didn't know yet where this connection might lead, but I knew I wanted to find out, and that the small, accidental moments we shared were just the beginning. It started as a simple favor. She had mentioned, almost in passing, that she was struggling with a stubborn shelf in her apartment, one of those awkward pieces of furniture that never seems to cooperate. I offered to help, trying to keep my voice casual, but inside, there was a quiet thrill at the thought of spending more time near her. When I arrived, she opened the door with that familiar soft smile, holding the shelf like it weighed nothing at all. "Thanks for coming," she said, her tone light, but there was a subtle tension beneath it, a mixture of gratitude and the unspoken question of why I was really here. As we maneuvered the shelf together, our bodies occasionally brushed. Each accidental touch sent a small jolt through me, sharp and warm, reminding me just how human and present she was. When our hands met on a screw or a board, I lingered a fraction longer than necessary, savoring the warmth and the texture of her skin. She didn't pull away, instead, she seemed slightly amused, her eyes sparkling with playful curiosity. Her laughter filled the room when I struggled to align the shelf just right, a soft, musical sound that made the small apartment feel lighter somehow. I noticed the way her hair fell across her shoulder as she bent down to help, and the faint scent of her shampoo mingling with the wood polish we were using. It was intimate without words, a closeness that felt natural and yet charged with unspoken tension. At one point, she reached over my shoulder to steady the shelf, our faces almost brushing. I caught the quiet rhythm of her breath and the subtle tilt of her head as she concentrated. For a fleeting moment, the world outside the apartment ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us, inches apart, aware of each other in ways neither of us had fully admitted. We paused to admire the finished shelf, and she turned toward me with that small, genuine smile that had become so familiar. Our shoulders brushed as we shifted to adjust a final screw, and I felt a quiet warmth in that contact, a silent acknowledgement of the closeness we'd built. Before leaving, she thanked me again, her hand briefly resting on my arm. It was a small gesture, fleeting, but it lingered in my mind long after I stepped back into the hallway. Even in those ordinary moments, I realized the tension between us was growing, subtle yet undeniable, a mix of curiosity, attraction, and emotional intimacy forming naturally with every shared glance, every accidental touch. Walking back to my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about how simple acts, moving a shelf, brushing hands, shared laughter, could carry so much unspoken meaning. I understood, in that moment, that the slow pull toward her was only just beginning, and that each small encounter was building something far deeper than either of us expected. A few evenings later, the air felt heavier than usual, soft, almost intimate, as if the world outside had pressed pause. She had invited me over under the pretext of needing help organizing some old boxes, but I sensed there was more behind the request. As I stepped inside, the apartment felt warm and lived in, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft vanilla of a candle she had lit. The lighting was gentle, casting comforting shadows that made every corner feel personal, private. We moved slowly through the boxes, chatting lightly at first, but then a pause fell between us. I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a small photo frame, and her gaze softened, distant. "He always liked this song," she said quietly, almost to herself, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. There was a pause, a delicate weight in the air, before she looked at me with eyes that seemed to carry both grief and resilience. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against hers as I offered to steady the frame. The contact was brief but grounding. I felt the warmth of her skin and the subtle tension in her grip, a quiet reminder of the emotions she held close to her chest. She didn't pull away, instead, she gave me a small, grateful smile, and for a moment, the apartment felt suspended in quiet intimacy. We sat down on the couch, shoulders brushing, and she spoke softly about her late husband. Not in sorrowful detail, but with a tone that revealed longing, memory, and the gentle ache of loss. Her words were deliberate, honest, and vulnerable. I listened, not offering empty reassurances, but allowing the silence to hold its own weight. The gentle rise and fall of her breathing, the faint catch in her voice, the way her eyes glistened in the dim light, it all drew me in, made me acutely aware of how deeply she carried her heart. At one point, her hand rested lightly on my arm, fleeting yet deliberate, as if testing the boundary of comfort. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, an undeniable connection forming in that shared stillness. Her vulnerability wasn't something to fix or solve, it was something to witness, to respect, and it made the growing bond between us feel profoundly real. By the time I left, the apartment felt quieter, but my thoughts were loud. I replayed her words, the softness in her voice, the subtle touches, and the way she had let me see a piece of herself few others ever would. That evening marked a shift, not just in our proximity, but in the depth of trust forming between us. I realized then that this slow, tentative closeness was no accident. It was the beginning of something far more meaningful, fragile, and compelling than either of us could yet name. By now, our interactions had developed a rhythm. There was comfort in the familiarity, but beneath it, a quiet tension simmered, like a secret thread connecting us that neither of us dared to name aloud. That evening, she invited me over under the pretext of needing help with a small household task, but there was an unmistakable spark in her eyes, a mischievous glint that suggested this visit would be different. She greeted me with her usual soft smile, but there was a playful lilt to her voice. "I hope you're ready for trouble," she teased lightly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. I raised an eyebrow, matching her challenge with my own grin. "Trouble? I'm not sure I can handle trouble tonight," I replied, feeling a flutter in my chest at the easy banter. We moved around the apartment, organizing a stack of books and knickknacks, and each small interaction carried a subtle tension. Our hands brushed repeatedly as we passed items back and forth. Each touch was fleeting, innocent, yet it lingered in my senses, the warmth of her hand, the softness of her skin, the brief shiver that ran through me whenever our fingers met. She noticed, I think, the way I hesitated just a fraction longer than necessary, and her smirk deepened, teasing without words. Her laughter filled the room when I fumbled with a particularly stubborn bookend, soft and musical, lighting up the space around us. I felt the warmth of her presence close to me as she leaned over to adjust something on the shelf, her hair brushing my shoulder. It was intimate, natural, and yet charged in a way that neither of us could ignore. At one point, she placed a book in my hands and held my gaze a second longer than expected. "You really enjoy being around trouble, don't you?" she asked softly, her tone playful but edged with curiosity. I could only smile, my own heart quickening. The teasing was a game, but it was a game that revealed more than either of us admitted. As the evening wore on, I realized the playful challenges and small touches had opened something unspoken between us. There was excitement in the ambiguity, a quiet thrill in the way our proximity created a delicate tension neither of us wanted to break. The combination of her teasing, her gentle glances, and the warmth of her presence left me thinking that this connection was evolving into something far deeper than a casual friendship. By the time I left, I walked back to my apartment with a smile tugging at my lips. Each laugh, each playful remark, each brush of our hands lingered in my mind. It was clear, the spark between us wasn't just curiosity, it was the beginning of a slow, compelling pull, a connection that was impossible to ignore and growing stronger with every encounter. That evening, the apartment felt quieter than usual. The soft hum of the city outside contrasted with the gentle warmth inside, a stillness that seemed to pull us closer without a single word being spoken. I had come over, thinking it would be another casual visit to help her with a small household task, but the moment the door closed behind me, I realized something in the air had shifted. There was a tension, subtle but undeniable, threading through every glance, every small movement between us. We ended up sitting near the window, the glow of the streetlights outside filtering through thin curtains. A gentle rain had begun, tapping softly against the glass, adding an intimate soundtrack to the silence. She handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing mine as I took it. The contact was fleeting, yet I felt the warmth linger, spreading quietly through my chest. She didn't pull away, instead, she held my gaze, and I realized that both of us were aware of the charged quiet, the space between us, heavy with words unspoken, feelings unacknowledged. For a while, we just sat, listening to the rain, the world outside reduced to a soft blur. Then, in that stillness, she spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Your trouble." She paused, and I could see a flicker of playfulness mixed with seriousness in her eyes. "And I like trouble." My breath caught. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that neither of us had dared to put into conversation before. There was no rush, no drama, just the slow, deliberate acknowledgement of what had been quietly building between us. Her fingers brushed against mine again, tracing lightly along the back of my hand, and I felt a shiver of anticipation. The warmth, the closeness, the subtle rhythm of her heartbeat, it all made the silence speak louder than words ever could. We didn't leap into declarations or confessions of love. Instead, we lingered in that quiet understanding, recognizing that the tension we had nurtured over days and weeks had reached a point of clarity. I could sense her hesitation, the careful balance between longing and restraint, and it mirrored my own. Each look, each fleeting touch, each shared smile was deliberate yet natural, a dance we had been learning slowly. Before I left that evening, we shared a moment that felt suspended in time. Our hands remained lightly touching, and her smile was soft, quiet, intimate. I left with my thoughts spinning, aware that this was no ordinary connection. The spark, the teasing, the subtle touches, they had culminated into something far more profound. That night marked the emotional climax of our slow burn, and I knew that what we had was only beginning. It was a connection rooted in trust, tension, and undeniable attraction, one neither of us would forget any time soon. After that night, everything between us felt different. The teasing, the small touches, the quiet glances, all of it had built towards something neither of us could ignore any longer. When I stepped into her apartment that evening, there was a sense of ease, a calm intimacy that had quietly settled between us. The space was softly lit, candles flickering faintly, casting gentle shadows across the room. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where time slowed and only we existed. We sat on the couch, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly, the warmth from that contact spreading through me in a way that was both grounding and thrilling. She handed me a cup of tea, our fingers meeting briefly in the exchange. That small contact lingered, almost deliberately, and I could feel her awareness of it. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a subtle, human touch, but it carried the weight of everything we had been building toward: trust, connection, and quiet desire. We talked softly, laughing at small, trivial things, but the conversation wasn't really about the words. It was about the presence we shared, the understanding that had grown between us over the past weeks. Every glance, every brush of her hand against mine, every soft smile conveyed more than speech ever could. I felt the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the gentle warmth of her skin, and the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat, and I realized how natural it felt to be near her, to hold this space together. Our hands intertwined almost instinctively, fingers lacing together in a quiet acknowledgement of what had been building between us. There was no rush, no need for declarations, just a mutual understanding that we had found something rare and meaningful. It was a connection rooted in respect, care, and shared vulnerability, and it felt complete in its own gentle way. As the evening drew to a close, I left with a smile tugging at my lips, feeling that familiar warmth lingering in my chest. I knew this was only the beginning of a slow, deliberate journey together, one where attraction, trust, and emotional intimacy would continue to grow. The widow next door, the woman who had quietly challenged my life and stirred my heart, was no longer just a neighbor. She had become someone essential, a presence I couldn't imagine my days without, and the story of us had reached its first, perfectly tender chapter. If you enjoyed this story and the slow burn romance between the widow next door and our narrator, don't forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support helps bring these moments to life, and there's plenty more romance, drama, and emotional stories waiting for you, so hit that subscribe button and stay tuned.